Welcome to Nero's Secrets. I'm your host, Jimmy, and today's mystery is a chilling one. Hercule Poirot and the Whisper at the Window. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more mystery stories. Chapter 1. The Whisper at the Window. The rain fell in quiet ribbons against the pane, a gentle patter that blurred the garden beyond into a grey watercolour of hedges and half-bloomed rose bushes. In the drawing-room of Lavington House, the fire crackled softly, and the clock above the mantelpiece ticked with a heavy inevitability. It was the sort of English afternoon that made conversation seem a delicate art, and silence a comfort. Captain Arthur Hastings, retired and still quite convinced of his unremarkable deduction skills, stirred his tea and cast a glance at his companion. Seated opposite him, Monsieur Hercule Poirot, whose moustaches were as precisely waxed as his shoes were gleaming. Poirot had taken up temporary residence at Lavington House as the guest of Sir Cedric Lavington, a minor baronet with an interest in Egyptian antiquities and an unfortunate taste in waistcoats. The invitation had come after a chance encounter at the British Museum, where Sir Cedric had spoken with great enthusiasm about something curious at his country estate, though he had not elaborated further. "Tell me, Hastings," said Poirot suddenly, his accent thick with its usual Belgian precision. "Have you noticed anything odd about this household?" Hastings blinked. "Odd? No, not particularly. Though I suppose Miss Lavington is a little high-strung. Ah, Mademoiselle Lydia, a fine specimen of emotional repression, n'est-ce pas? And yet she speaks with the eyes rather than the tongue. That is always of interest." Hastings frowned. "You've noticed something, haven't you?" Poirot smiled faintly. "I have noticed many things, my friend, but nothing yet that cries out crime." He sipped his tisane. "Still, the atmosphere is, how shall we say, disquieted." Their conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Sir Cedric himself, his ruddy face alight with vague discomfort. "My dear Poirot," he said, adjusting his embroidered cravat, "I don't like to impose upon your holiday, but would you mind having a word with Lydia? She's in a state over something she saw last night, she says. Rather fanciful, I suspect." Poirot inclined his head. "But of course, Sir Cedric. Where is she now?" "In the west wing, drawing, room window. Says she heard whispering in the night, or saw someone, or both. Honestly, she's not making much sense." As Sir Cedric withdrew, Poirot rose and adjusted his cuffs. "Come, Hastings, we must listen to the whisper before it becomes a scream." The west wing of Lavington House was older than the rest of the building, with uneven floors and a peculiar draught that crept under the skirting. They found Lydia Lavington seated by the tall Georgian window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She did not rise when they entered. She was pale, almost fragile-looking, with a rigid composure that suggested steel beneath her soft-spoken manner. Her hair was gathered in a bun too tight for fashion, and her clothes bore a primness that bordered on austere. "Miss Lavington," said Poirot gently, "I understand you had an unsettling experience last night." She turned to him, her voice low. "I don't know what I saw, Monsieur Poirot, or heard, but I was sitting here reading just after midnight. Everyone else had gone to bed, and then there was a whisper." "A whisper?" Poirot leaned slightly forward. "Yes, at the window, right behind me. I turned and I saw a face. I'm sure I did. Just for a moment, lit by the moonlight, watching me. Could you describe this face, mademoiselle? She hesitated. No, it was gone too quickly. But I heard it again. The whispering. It wasn't in English. I think it was French. Poirot's eyes flickered with interest. Indeed. And was the window open? No. Locked. That's what frightened me. It was as if the sound was coming through the glass. Did you inform your father? She looked down. He said I was imagining things, that perhaps I'd been reading too much. But I know what I heard. Very well, said Poirot calmly. We shall investigate with the method and the order. Hastings, the window, if you please. Hastings examined the latch. It's sturdy, and the ground outside is gravel. It would be hard for someone to creep close without making a sound. Poirot knelt by the skirting and peered at the wall. He touched the frame lightly, then straightened. Mademoiselle, are you enemies? Enemies? She gave a short, bitter laugh. Only myself, I suspect, and perhaps one or two relatives who would rather I weren't the one to inherit mother's shares in the shipping company. Poirot inclined his head. An honest answer? Merci. That evening at dinner, Poirot was silent. Around the long dining table sat a curious assembly. Sir Cedric, bluff and self-absorbed, Lydia, tense and distant, Rupert Lavington, Sir Cedric's charming but idle nephew, Miss Judith Grey, a governess turned companion with a quiet defiance in her eyes, and Mr. Howard Ellery, a solicitor with the driest voice Hastings had ever encountered. As the soup was cleared, Poirot's gaze flickered between the guests. He was not listening to what they said so much as how they said it. Every look, every pause, every shift of posture, each detail tucked away. Later, as he and Hastings retired to their adjoining rooms, the detective looked thoughtful. You believe Lydia imagined it? Hastings asked. Poirot shook his head slowly. Non, mon ami. Mademoiselle Lavington is not mad, but someone wants her to seem so. He stepped to his window, gazing out at the garden beyond. There is a whisper in this house, Hastings, not just at the window, but in the very air. A whisper of secrets, and soon, I fear, it will become a cry. Chapter 2. The Figure in the Garden. The following morning broke with a dull, overcast sky that seemed to press low upon the grounds of Lavington House. The mist had settled like a damp veil across the hedgerows and gravel paths, rendering the garden statues ghostly and indistinct. Hercule Poirot, immaculately dressed in a dove-grey suit with a lilac cravat, stood beneath the ivy-covered portico, surveying the garden with arms folded behind his back. Captain Hastings joined him, stretching his arms and stifling a yawn. "You're out early, Poirot." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Mais oui, there is something about the morning light, mon ami. It reveals the imperfections of the day before, and perhaps, too, the secrets of the night." He motioned towards the west wing. "I have already walked the perimeter below Mademoiselle Lydia's window. The gravel shows no disturbance, no footprints, no scuffing, nothing to suggest a prowler. And yet—" Hastings followed his gaze to the base of the garden wall, where a narrow path disappeared behind a hedge of yews. "What is it?" "Observe, just beyond the shrubbery, there is a faint impression on the earth. a bend in the grass, as though someone had stood there for some time, looking up toward the house. It is not proof, but it is suggestive. As they approached, Hastings saw it too, a subtle crushing of the grass, recently made and too centralized to be casual. Could have been one of the gardeners, Hastings offered. Mr. Reeves, the head gardener, informs me that no one comes to this side of the grounds after dusk. Besides, Poirot added, crouching slightly and plucking a small item from the grass, a gardener does not wear Italian leather. He held up a button, dark, polished, and unmistakably from a tailored coat. Hastings whistled softly. So, someone was standing here looking into Lydia's window. Perhaps, or perhaps placing something there. We must consider the possibilities. They returned to the house in silence. Poirot's brow furrowed in thought. At breakfast, the atmosphere was strained. Lydia sat rigidly at the table, barely touching her food. Rupert Lavington, handsome and perpetually amused, buttered his toast with the carefree detachment of one unconcerned by whispers in the night. "So, cousin," he said lightly, "still being haunted by French ghosts." Lydia's teacup clinked audibly as she set it down. "I didn't imagine it, Rupert." "Of course you didn't. I always say, if one must hallucinate, do it in style. French is infinitely more fashionable than, say, German." Sir Cedric grunted, folding the newspaper irritably. "I won't have this nonsense continue. The staff is beginning to gossip. If Lydia's having delusions, then—" "She is not," Poirot interrupted mildly. "Mademoiselle Lavington has an excellent memory and a calm disposition under stress. Her senses are not easily deceived." The table fell quiet. Judith Gray, the companion governess, looked up from her porridge with a faint nod of agreement, but said nothing. Hastings, ever the observer of emotional undercurrents, found himself watching her more closely. There was something unusually tense about the way she sat. Back too straight, shoulders drawn. Had she overheard something last night, or seen something from her own window? After breakfast, Poirot excused himself to inspect a matter of architectural interest in the library, but Hastings knew better. As he lingered near the staircase, hoping to spot Judith in passing, he was intercepted by Howard Ellery, the family solicitor. "May I have a word, Captain Hastings?" The man's voice was dry as dust, his eyes sharp behind steel-rimmed spectacles. "Certainly." They stepped into the study, a dark-panelled room lined with legal volumes and smelling faintly of pipe smoke. Ellery closed the door behind them. "Forgive the intrusion, but I feel obliged to clarify something in light of recent excitements." Hastings raised a brow. "Yes." "Miss Lydia Lavington is the principal heir to Lady Margaret's fortune. Her shares in the Lavington shipping concern, to be precise. Upon turning 30, she receives full control. That happens in 4 weeks. And this is unusual. Not entirely, but there are certain clauses that could, under specific circumstances, shift that inheritance elsewhere." "What sort of circumstances?" "Primarily, mental instability. If she were declared unfit to manage the estate, the trusteeship would pass to Sir Cedric. Failing him, Rupert." Hastings absorbed this in silence. "I thought it pertinent," said Ellery, smoothing his cuffs, "in light of her recent reports of whispering faces at windows." He left without another word. Later that afternoon, Poirot summoned Hastings to the library. He had laid out a map of the estate on the table, along with a few handwritten notes. "My friend," Poirot said calmly, "a pattern begins to emerge." "Already?" "Already," Poirot nodded. "We have an attempted gaslighting, a conveniently placed heirloom fortune, and a cast of characters each with a motive to unsettle Mademoiselle Lydia's mind." Hastings frowned. "Do you think someone's trying to make her think she's going mad?" "Not merely think it. Convince others of it. Therein lies the danger. To discredit someone mentally is to remove them from power without violence." Eov tapped his notes. "And yet there has been violence. Subtle, yes, but real. I believe last night's whisper was not the first move, Hastings. It was merely the first notice." Poirot walked to the window, where the grey light of afternoon had begun to dim. "Tonight," he said softly, "we shall see if the whisper returns." Chapter 3. The Clock That Struck Twice. Night returned to Lavington House with a stillness so thick it seemed almost deliberate. The mist from the day had settled low across the grounds, clinging to the shrubs and gravel like a heavy veil. Within the west wing, Lydia Lavington sat once again at the tall Georgian window, a book open in her lap but forgotten. The lamplight carved golden shadows across the wood-panelled walls, while the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corridor beyond marked time with mechanical precision. She had left the curtains drawn back. At Poirot's suggestion, he had asked her to behave as if nothing had changed, to return to her reading chair and to leave the lights on. "The Whisperer," he had said, "prefers an audience who is unaware. If he returns, he must believe you are alone." Lydia glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. 11:30. The room was silent save for the occasional creak of the old house settling into the night. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then fell silent. Suddenly she heard it, the faintest rustle, a whisper, not in words but a sibilant hush, like someone breathing against glass. She froze. The sound came again. This time it was unmistakable. A low, whispering murmur, not loud but persistent, and again not in English. Her heart pounded. She did not turn, remembering Poirot's advice. React not like the startled deer, but the observant cat. Then came the sharp tap. Once, twice, 3 times on the window-pane. And then silence. Lydia stood slowly and turned. The window was empty, but as she stepped closer, her breath caught. A faint outline, a shape, remained on the outside of the glass. A foggy impression, as if a face had been pressed there. Then, as she stared, it vanished into the mist. Moments later, Poirot entered with Hastings at his side. Lydia pointed to the window. He was there. Again. I heard him. I felt him. Poirot moved with swift precision, examining the latch, the glass, and the exterior wall from the inside. Hastings pulled back the curtains and peered into the darkness. "Anything?" Poirot asked without looking. Hastings squinted. "I can't see a thing, but wait, what's that?" He opened the window and leaned slightly out. Something small and hard fell to the floor with a dull thud. Hastings retrieved it. A coin. Foreign. He passed it to Poirot, who held it delicately between gloved fingers. "A 5-franc piece," Poirot murmured. "Old. Not in circulation for years." Lydia blinked. I don't understand. Why throw that at my window?" Poirot did not answer immediately. He studied the coin's tarnished surface, then turned toward Lydia. "Because it is not about the coin. It is about what the coin represents. What do you mean?" But Poirot merely said, "This is no prank. Mademoiselle, you are being carefully, deliberately unsettled." They reconvened in Poirot's room half an hour later. Hastings, seated near the fireplace, watched Poirot pace with his usual controlled precision. "I examined the window frame," Poirot said. "There were traces of pressure. Someone was indeed standing below it, possibly on a concealed box or crate to reach that height." "Couldn't have been easy," Hastings added. "That gravel is loud." "Unless the figure came not from the garden," Poirot replied, "but from within the house." Hastings blinked. "You think it was someone inside?" Poirot paused. "Consider, the window is not easily accessed from the outside without making noise. And yet Mademoiselle heard a whisper, as if from the other side of the pane. But sound does not pass through thick Georgian glass easily. The whisper, if it occurred, must have been produced very near her, possibly even from within the room. But she saw a face. She saw a shape. In fog, through lamplight. That is not the same." Hastings exhaled slowly. "So you think someone is sneaking into the West Wing at night? What would be the point?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "To make Miss Lydia doubt herself. To have others believe she is descending into delusion. To isolate her. Once isolated, she becomes vulnerable to influence and legal manoeuvring. And that coin?" Poirot lifted it again. "A signature. A ghost of the past. An allusion to something shared between the victim and the perpetrator. Perhaps a memory or a warning." The next morning, news of the incident had already reached the breakfast table, though no one admitted to spreading it. Sir Cedric frowned into his eggs. "Blast it, Lydia! Are you saying someone broke into the house?" Lydia shook her head. "No, I'm saying someone was there, watching me, whispering." Rupert chuckled softly. "I hope you at least offered our ghost some tea." Poirot looked up from his toast. "You find this amusing, monsieur?" Rupert smiled easily. "Well, yes. I mean, it's just so melodramatic. Whispering at windows, coins from nowhere. It sounds like something from a serial novel." "And yet," said Poirot quietly, "melodrama often precedes tragedy." Rupert looked away. After breakfast, Judith Grey asked Poirot for a moment alone. They walked together along the terrace, the air brisk and still wet from the previous night's mist. "I didn't want to speak in front of the others," Judith said, her voice low. "But I think I saw someone last night. A shadow, moving through the west hallway, around midnight." "Did you recognize the figure?" "No, it was quick. I was going to fetch a book from the library. I didn't want to cause alarm. I thought perhaps it was Sir Cedric or Rupert. But now—" Poirot's face remained unreadable. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have done well to speak." As she turned to go, he asked gently, "And forgive me, do you speak French?" Judith blinked. "Yes, I studied it in Paris as a girl." "Why?" Poirot only smiled. "Curiosity, mademoiselle, purely that." When she was gone, Poirot tapped the notebook in his pocket. Whispers in the night, coins from the past, and now a shadow in the corridor. he murmured. "The net tightens, Hastings, but who has woven it, and for what end?" Chapter 4. The Fracture in the Frame. A steady drizzle tapped against the high windows of the study, and within the house the storm was no longer only outside. At noon, a sudden cry had echoed from the east corridor. Mrs. Redburn, the long-serving housekeeper, had found the library doors ajar and the framed portrait of Lady Margaret Lavington lying shattered on the carpet. Glass glittered like ice along the rug, and the heavy gilt frame bore a visible crack down its right edge, cleaving Lady Margaret's painted face into two grim halves. Poirot arrived moments later, summoned by Hastings, and immediately knelt beside the fallen portrait. His gaze was fixed not on the broken glass, but on the wall from which it had fallen. The hook remained in place. The cord had not snapped. The picture had been taken down, or torn down, by deliberate force. Sir Cedric hovered near the doorway, thunder in his voice. "This is an outrage. That portrait hung in the same place for 30 years. Why destroy it now?" Poirot did not look up. To send a message, perhaps. Lydia arrived next, breathless and pale. At the sight of her mother's ruined likeness, her expression crumpled into something complex. Part grief, part rage. This was her favourite room, she said. She always reads here after supper. Poirot gently picked up a fragment of the broken glass and examined it in the light. "Monsieur Ellery," he called as the solicitor entered behind Lydia. "Do you recall the portrait's placement?" "Yes, directly above the hearth." "Why?" Poirot pointed to the scuff marks on the floor just beneath the frame's original location. "Notice, the dust is disturbed. There were footprints, very faint. Someone stood here recently, and very still." "But the hearth hasn't been used in days," Ellery said slowly. "Exactly," Poirot replied. "There was no reason to approach the fireplace, unless they meant to remove something." "A letter hidden behind the frame?" Hastings guessed. "Perhaps," Poirot said thoughtfully. "Or perhaps something more symbolic. Lady Margaret's presence was strongest in this room. It is possible the act was one of psychological violence, intended to destabilize, not merely to deface." Lydia's voice was quiet but firm. "My mother trusted few people. She kept her papers in the desk drawer, but only I know which ones mattered." Poirot nodded. "Then we must check whether any are missing." But when Lydia opened the desk, everything appeared in place. She rifled through the compartments, frowned and paused. "There was a letter," she said slowly, "from a man named Etienne Beaufort. My mother knew him before the war. French. She kept it hidden, never discussed it. I remember the handwriting, it was slanted and very fine. But now—" She held up the file of personal correspondences. "It's gone." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Etienne Beaufort. The name. Hastings, do you recall it?" Hastings blinked. "Should I?" Poirot paced. He was an antiquities dealer, imprisoned in 1926 for fraud involving forged manuscripts. Lady Margaret's fortune came from her father's trade in rare European texts. Yes, the connection is there. You think he blackmailed her?" Lydia asked. "I think the letter was leveraged, or at least a piece in a greater puzzle. Now someone has retrieved it, quietly, but not without cost." They heard footsteps then, rapid, uneven, echoing from the lower corridor. Judith Grey appeared, clutching her shawl and visibly shaken. I must speak with you, she said, eyes darting toward Lydia. Privately, if I may. Poirot guided her into the smaller parlour, Hastings at his heels. I didn't know whether to say anything, Judith began, voice trembling. But last night, after I saw the shadow in the hall, I heard someone come up the stairs. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Not from the guest hallway? No, the servants' stairs. I only noticed because I had gone to fetch a candle. I'd left mine burning low. The person was careful, slow steps, but I heard a soft humming. A tune? Hastings asked. No, just a single note. Hummed low, almost like a chant. Poirot was silent for a moment. You saw nothing? Nothing clearly, just movement. And I think it was Rupert. Rupert! Hastings exclaimed. But why would he use the back stairs? That's just it, Judith whispered. He doesn't know I used that passage to reach the old linen room. I saw him glance over his shoulder. He didn't expect anyone. Poirot folded his arms. And what time was this? Shortly after midnight. Poirot gave a quiet nod. Thank you, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful. When she had gone, Hastings turned to him. So Rupert could have been the one whispering outside Lydia's window. Could have been, Poirot replied, but we do not accuse mon ami until the facts align. Rupert has a motive. If Lydia is declared unfit, the estate falls to Sir Cedric, and Rupert inherits from him. True, but more than inheritance is at play. Consider the whispers in French, the coin, the stolen letter from Beaufort. There is an older story here, buried beneath the present. Poirot walked to the window, looking out at the grey sky. We are not merely solving a mystery, Hastings. We are exhuming a ghost. Chapter 5. The Scent in the Stairwell. The next day broke with a chill that seeped into the bones of Lavington House. Clouds hung low over the estate, and a thin fog still clung to the garden's edges, lending the manor an air of hushed expectancy. Inside, Poirot moved through the corridors with unhurried purpose, his polished shoes clicking softly against the parquet floors as he considered the weight of the events thus far. He had requested an interview with Rupert Lavington, not in the drawing-room or library, but in the conservatory, a glass-walled chamber fragrant with orange blossom and wilting lilies. It was a calculated choice. The space was both intimate and exposing. Rupert arrived fashionably late, a cigarette already lit and smouldering between his fingers. He smiled as he entered, all ease and charm, but there was a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Detective," he greeted, easing into the rattan chair opposite Poirot. "This is beginning to feel very official." Poirot inclined his head. "You flatter me, monsieur. I merely wish to understand the comings and goings of those within the household during these curious nights." "Curious is a word for it," Rupert said dryly. "Whispers, ghosts, smashed portraits. It's practically theatre. Though I suppose Lydia has always been a bit too fond of drama." Poirot's gaze remained steady. "You imply she is inventing things?" Rupert shrugged. "I imply nothing, Monsieur Poirot. But Lydia has always had a flair for melancholy. She likes being the centre of concern. And yet," Poirot said gently, "it is you who were seen last night on the servants' staircase." The cigarette paused halfway to Rupert's mouth. Judith told you that." Poirot did not answer. Rupert gave a short laugh. "I was retrieving a flask I'd hidden during my younger days. Foolish, really. I wanted a drink without being scolded by Uncle Cedric." "Is that a crime?" Poirot's tone remained calm. "And what of the soft humming that accompanied you?" Rupert blinked, then grinned. "A habit, I suppose. I hum when I'm anxious or tipsy. You may interpret that however you like." "Merci," Poirot said mildly. "One final question, monsieur. Do you speak French?" "Barely. A few phrases. Why?" Poirot smiled. "Because the whisper Miss Lydia heard was in French." Rupert stubbed out his cigarette, visibly annoyed. "I'm not your villain, Poirot. I haven't got the energy." "Nor perhaps the subtlety," Poirot murmured as Rupert left. "That evening, just as the clock in the main hall struck 9:30, a scream rang out from the upper corridor. A short, sharp cry that halted everyone mid-step. Poirot and Hastings were first to reach the landing, followed closely by Lydia and Sir Cedric. The governess, Judith Grey, stood at the top of the stairs, clutching the banister with white knuckles. "It's Mrs. Redburn," she said, breathless. "She fell down the back stairwell." They rushed down to the narrow servants' staircase, behind the kitchen, where the elderly housekeeper lay crumpled at the bottom, her head bleeding where it had struck the lowest step. A maid hovered nearby, sobbing and wringing her hands. She was bringing linen down. She never takes that staircase." Poirot knelt beside the unconscious woman, his expression grave. "Call Dr. Glenister immediately," he said, "and clear the stairwell. Hastings, assist me." As they waited for the doctor, Poirot examined the narrow flight of stairs. Steep, poorly lit, but not dangerous under normal circumstances. He peered closely at the top step, then touched the rail with his gloved fingers. "There," he murmured. "Do you smell it, Hastings?" Hastings leaned down. "Something floral, faint, but it's there. Lily of the Valley perfume," Poirot said softly. "A very particular scent." He turned to the banister and sniffed again. The same perfume lingered faintly along the wood. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Someone was here shortly before Mrs. Redburn fell, and that someone was wearing perfume. Unusual perfume, not the sort worn by elderly housekeepers. Judith Grey returned moments later, clearly shaken. "Is she alive?" "Oui, but in danger. She will need observation. Dr. Glenister is en route." "Yes. Lydia sent a boy with a bicycle." Poirot nodded. "Tell me, mademoiselle, do you own Lily of the Valley perfume?" She blinked. "No, I've always preferred orange blossoms. Why?" "Just a detail," Poirot said. "But such details matter, do they not?" Upstairs, Hastings frowned. "You don't think this was an accident?" Poirot's gaze turned grave. "No. I think Mrs. Redburn saw something, or someone, and they could not allow her to speak." They moved quietly back to the drawing-room, where the atmosphere had grown taut with tension. Lydia sat stiffly by the fire. Rupert paced near the window, and Sir Cedric had poured himself a drink larger than his doctor would have approved. The silence broke only when Poirot entered. "I would ask you all," he said calmly, "to remain in the house tomorrow. No excursions, no errands. There has been an attempt, not merely mischief, but at murder." Sir Cedric nearly dropped his glass. "Murder?" "Oui, monsieur. A gentle push on a dark staircase at just the right moment. Mrs. Redburn is an old woman. But she is not careless. She would not have fallen of her own accord. Rupert looked from one face to the next. "This is absurd." "No," said Poirot quietly. "This is deliberate, and it began with a whisper at a window. Now it has grown bolder." He turned to Hastings. "There is one among us, mon ami, who seeks to erase the past. But in doing so, they only make it clearer. It is time we look not only at what has happened here, but what was buried long before." Chapter 6. The Name in the Ledger. The morning after Mrs. Redburn's fall dawned cold and brittle, with frost crusting the lead-trimmed windows of Lavington House. The household moved in hushed tones, as though afraid their voices might disturb the fragile balance that held the silence together. Dr. Glenister had come and gone, reporting that Mrs. Redburn remained unconscious but stable, though it was clear to Poirot and to those who watched him closely that the mystery had reached a darker threshold. In the study, Poirot stood alone by the high window, a leather-bound ledger open on the desk before him. The housekeeper's keys had been located, and with Lydia's permission, Poirot had begun to examine certain domestic archives Mrs. Redburn had maintained with quiet diligence. She had been more than just a servant. She had been in some ways the silent keeper of Lavington House's legacy. Hastings entered quietly. "No change with Redburn?" Poirot shook his head. "None. But perhaps she has already told us what we need to know. On paper." He tapped the ledger. "Look here. A household inventory maintained since 1923. Receipts, staff notes, visitors' names, all written in Mrs. Redburn's careful script." He flipped a few pages, and here, in the spring of 1931, a note: "Guest room linens prepared. Mr. E. Beaufort arrived from Calais. Stayed 4 nights. No further visits noted." Hastings frowned. "That's almost 15 years ago." "Oui. And yet this visit was never mentioned by Lady Margaret to her family, or to Lydia. And Beaufort's name, you recall, was on the letter that went missing from her desk. Coincidence? I do not believe in them." He leaned closer to the page. "But what strikes me is the annotation in the margin, subtle but present. A single word, regret, underlined twice. Written by Mrs. Redburn? Likely? She was discreet but observant. That she wrote it at all is telling. She knew something about that visit." Hastings straightened. "So Beaufort came here. He stayed. And something happened. Something Lady Margaret chose to hide." Poirot nodded, "Which brings us to motive. If someone here knew of that visit, knew what Beaufort represented, then the missing letter, the broken portrait, even the staged whispers, may all be part of a scheme to prevent certain truths from emerging." He closed the ledger gently. "Let us now consider Lydia." Hastings blinked. "You suspect her?" "No," Poirot said thoughtfully, "but someone does. Someone wants others to suspect her. If Lydia is perceived as mentally unwell, her position as heir weakens. And if Mrs. Redburn, who perhaps knew Lady Margaret's past too well, were to share her knowledge with Lydia, she would become dangerous." He turned to the door. "Come, Hastings. We shall speak with Mademoiselle Lydia. Again. But this time we shall ask not about the whispers, but about her mother." They found Lydia in the garden room, seated by the window with a blanket across her knees. She looked up as they entered, eyes shadowed but alert. "Is there any news?" she asked quietly. Poirot bowed. "No change, but we are pursuing another line of inquiry, one concerning your mother." She stiffened. "My mother?" "Yes, mademoiselle. May I ask, did she ever speak of a Monsieur Etienne Beaufort?" Lydia blinked, visibly startled. "No, only that once, when I found the letter. I asked her, and she dismissed it. Said it was a business contact of my grandfather's, nothing more. She seemed embarrassed." Poirot nodded. "And did she ever mention visiting Calais, or France at all in the years before her marriage?" Lydia shook her head. "I thought she hated the continent. She was always so traditional. Everything English, everything proper." Poirot paced slowly. "And yet this Monsieur Beaufort stayed here, in this very house, when you were still a teenager." Lydia's expression faltered. "Here? But I don't remember anyone of that name, not in the guest wing, and I would have known." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "Unless he was kept hidden, unless his presence here was not as a guest, but as a secret." Lydia said nothing for a moment. Then softly, "Are you saying my mother had an affair?" Poirot's voice remained calm. "I am saying that Monsieur Beaufort came here in 1931, that Lady Margaret concealed his visit, that a letter from him remained hidden in her private correspondence, and that someone has gone to great lengths to ensure that whatever link existed between them remains buried." Hastings interjected gently. "Would it matter if it were true?" Lydia gave a hollow laugh. "To this house? To these people? Of course it would matter. My inheritance depends on perception, on the idea that I am the daughter of a respected English family. If my mother's past was less tidy, there are those who would use it against me." Poirot nodded slowly. "That is what I fear. And more than perception, there may be something deeper. A truth that binds someone here to Beaufort's visit. Perhaps even a connection of blood." Lydia's eyes widened. "You mean a child?" Poirot held up a hand. "I do not speculate, without evidence, but there are questions, and someone among us fears those questions deeply." Just then, a maid appeared at the door, breathless. "Monsieur Poirot, you asked to be told if anyone used the West Wing again." "Yes," Poirot said swiftly. "Well, just now, I saw Mr. Ellery coming out of the linen closet at the end of the hall. He looked very pale, and he dropped something in the waste bin before hurrying away." Poirot and Hastings exchanged a glance. "Come, mon ami," Poirot said. "We go to examine the refuse. It is not glamorous, but it may reveal what the parlour whispers do not." They ascended to the west corridor, where the bin sat innocuously beneath a window alcove. Inside, Poirot retrieved a crumpled envelope, charred at the edges as though someone had attempted to burn it hastily. He smoothed it out. The front was addressed in a foreign hand, to Lady Margaret Lavington, private, from Etienne Beaufort. Poirot's voice was very quiet. The letter was not removed to be stolen, Hastings. It was removed to be destroyed, but not completely. Someone was interrupted. "And Ellery?" Hastings asked. Poirot folded the envelope carefully. "He was close to Lady Margaret. He knows the law, the wills, the estates. He is discreet. He may know more than he admits. He looked out the tall, cold window. But so do others. We are now past games. The next move will not be whispered. It will scream. Chapter 7. The Storm. Within. By late afternoon, the sky had turned from pewter to a shade nearly black. Clouds hung low over Lavington House, pressing against the gables like a gathering tide, and when the storm finally broke, it did so with fury. Wind lashed the panes, and the downpour roared against the roof like rolling drums. Thunder cracked with a violence that made the chandeliers shiver. The family had gathered reluctantly in the drawing-room, Rupert by the fire with a Scotch in hand, Sir Cedric pacing near the window, Lydia seated with arms crossed and an unread book in her lap. Judith Grey stood by the corner cabinet, tense as a wire. Poirot and Hastings entered without announcement, the crumpled envelope held carefully in Poirot's hand. "I do hope," said Rupert dryly, "that the ceiling doesn't come in. It would be terribly poetic, lightning, secrets and familial, collapse." Poirot stepped to the centre of the room. "If collapse comes, monsieur, it will not be from the weather. It will come from the truth, and truth, I fear, is already seeping through the cracks." Sir Cedric turned with a grunt. "What the devil are you talking about now?" Poirot held up the charred envelope. "This, a letter to your late wife from Etienne Beaufort, nearly 80, destroyed. Found this afternoon in the waste bin outside the linen closet, freshly dropped." The room fell silent, save for the steady tapping of rain against the windows. "I'll ask again," Poirot continued. "Who knew of this letter? And who had reason to destroy it now, so long after Lady Margaret's death?" No one answered. Poirot turned to Howard Ellery, the solicitor, who stood near the back of the room with hands clasped too tightly behind his back. "You were seen leaving the corridor, monsieur, and your manner betrayed unease." Ellery met Poirot's gaze, but his voice lacked its usual crispness. "I admit I went into the linen room. I was searching for something, not a letter, but you found one," Poirot said, "and sought to burn it." Ellery hesitated. Then, with a sigh, "Yes, I found it tucked in the false bottom of an old drawer. I panicked. I thought it might tarnish Lady Margaret's name." "Or reveal more than that," Poirot said softly. "Might I suggest, Mr. Ellery, that you were not concerned only with her name, but with protecting someone else?" "I was protecting the estate," Ellery said, his voice tightening. "If it became known that Lady Margaret had dealings with a known fraudster—" Poirot interrupted gently. "Then why not bring the letter to Sir Cedric, or to Mademoiselle Lydia, her heir? Why burn it in secret?" Ellery was silent. From her corner, Judith spoke. "Because it wasn't about fraud. It was about a child, wasn't it?" All heads turned to her. Judith's face was pale but composed. "I suspected it for months. I used to look after the family papers before Lydia turned 21, and I once found a reference, barely legible, to a sum sent regularly to a home in France, a woman named Matilda Beaufort. I dismissed it at the time, but when Lydia found that letter and mentioned Beaufort, I remembered." Sir Cedric turned on her. "Are you accusing Margaret of what, exactly?" Judith's voice shook only slightly. "I don't accuse her of anything, but I believe Lady Margaret had a child before she married you, and that child was hidden, perhaps even sent away. The only reason to erase Beaufort's connection now would be if someone feared that secret coming to light." Poirot's voice, soft as ever, broke the hush. And such a revelation, if true, could disrupt more than reputations. It could call into question legitimacy, inheritance, lines of succession. Lydia stood slowly. "You're saying I might not be the rightful heir?" "No," said Poirot. "I say only that someone fears that you are, and has tried to convince the world otherwise. That someone hoped to remove you, not through violence, but through suspicion, whispers, accidents." Rupert scoffed. "All of this over a letter, a theory? Come now." Judith turned to him. "You laughed when Lydia said she heard whispers. You made her feel mad. You call this a farce, but you've had access to every corner of this house. You knew about the inheritance conditions." Rupert's face hardened. "So did everyone else." Judith's voice dropped. "But you were the only one caught on the servants' staircase, humming." A pause. Rupert's eyes narrowed. "That doesn't prove anything." Poirot stepped forward. "Non, monsieur. But what might? A set of footprints in the gravel, a scrap of glove left on a stair rail, or a bottle of lily-of-the-valley perfume that you could not possibly explain." Rupert went still. "It's not mine," he said finally. "I don't use perfume." "Then you will not object," Poirot said calmly, "if I search your room?" "No," Rupert said, his voice sharp now. "You'll find nothing." Poirot gave a small, knowing smile. "We shall see." He turned to Hastings. "We must begin preparing, mon ami. The truth is nearly within our grasp, but it will not come gently. The storm is not outside. It is in this house." Another crash of thunder rattled the windows, and above them, unnoticed in the corridor, a door creaked open softly, then closed. Chapter 8. The Box Beneath the Floorboards. The storm battered Lavington House with renewed vengeance that night, thrashing against the eaves like some great invisible sea. As lightning carved brief white streaks across the sky, Poirot and Hastings ascended the main staircase with deliberate steps, their destination, Rupert Lavington's bedchamber. Sir Cedric had not protested, only muttered something about not wishing to impede the truth if it ever bothered to turn up. Lydia had withdrawn quietly to her room, while Judith had chosen to sit with Mrs. Redburn, who remained unconscious but now stable under the doctor's observation. Rupert, however, had disappeared. "He did not return to the drawing-room," Hastings noted. "Could he be hiding something?" Poirot's eyes glittered. "Mais oui. But it is not only what he hides, Hastings. It is why he hides it." "That is what interests me." Rupert's room was in the south wing, overlooking the rose gardens. It was smartly kept, though not pristine. A scattering of books on the nightstand, a half-drunk glass of port, and a heavy wool dressing-gown draped over the chair spoke to someone who lived with ease but not indolence. Poirot began his examination with characteristic precision, moving from drawer to drawer with gloved hands, touching nothing without purpose. Hastings watched him work, marvelling as always at how seemingly mundane items could gain sudden significance under Poirot's gaze. In the top drawer of the wardrobe, Poirot paused. "Look here," he said, holding up a small bottle. A scent bottle, nearly empty. Hastings leaned in. "Perfume?" Poirot uncapped it, sniffed once, then nodded. "Lily of the Valley, the same fragrance I detected on the banister near the back stair." But he said it wasn't his. Poirot smiled faintly. Yes, he did. And yet here it is. He lied. But the question remains, why would a man keep such a scent in his possession? For a woman? Possibly. But more curious still is where the scent lingered. Not in his room, not on his clothes, but on a staircase no one should have been on at night. And now, a bottle here. Mon ami, we are close. He turned next to the floor beneath the dressing table. Stooping carefully, Poirot tapped along the edge of the skirting board, then the floorboards themselves. His fingers slowed at one particular plank, slightly warped and fractionally loose. With Hastings' help, he pried it up. A narrow recess had been hollowed beneath. Within it, wrapped in a faded scarf, was a small tin box. Poirot removed it gently and opened the lid. Inside they found a set of old photographs, yellowed with age, showing a younger Lady Margaret beside a man in a Parisian street. Clearly, Etienne Beaufort. A folded document in French, birth records by the look of it. A second envelope, sealed with red wax bearing no name. Poirot examined the birth record with narrowed eyes. Mathilde Beaufort, he read. Born 1912. Mother, Margaret Ellington. Father, Etienne Beaufort. No mention of marriage. He looked at Hastings. Lady Margaret had a daughter, illegitimate and born abroad, and here. He lifted the sealed envelope, weighing it in his palm. This may be the final letter, the one that explains everything. But we must not open it yet. Not until all parties are present. To do so now would be to confront a truth that must be heard with all ears. They resealed the plank, replaced the dressing table, and descended quietly back to the main hall. But as they reached the last step, Judith Grey appeared, pale and visibly shaken. "I was just coming to find you," she said. "There's something you need to know." Poirot studied her intently. "You are trembling, mademoiselle." "I should be. I've just come from Sir Cedric's study. I heard Rupert and him arguing behind the door, loudly, about money, and then I heard something strange." "What was said?" Judith hesitated. "Rupert was demanding something. Documents, I think. Sir Cedric shouted that Rupert had no claim, and that not even Margaret could change that. Then he mentioned the name Mathilde." Poirot stiffened slightly. "Mathilde. So Sir Cedric knew, or at least suspected." "Yes," Judith nodded. "And then suddenly it went quiet. I didn't hear anyone leave. I waited, then knocked, but no one answered. The door was locked." Poirot glanced at Hastings. "We must go, now." They moved quickly toward the study at the far end of the AHD hall. The house around them seemed even more oppressive under the weight of the storm, each gust of wind seeming to whisper warnings through the gaps in the window frames. At the door to the study, Poirot knocked. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. He turned the handle. Locked. "Stand back, Hastings." A forceful shove from Hastings's shoulder broke the latch. The door swung open, and there, beneath the heavy green reading lamp, slumped in the leather chair, was Sir Cedric Lavington. A blot of crimson spread across his shirt front. A letter opener, silver, ornate, jutted from his chest like a dagger. Judith gasped. Poirot crossed the room, fingers seeking a pulse. His jaw tightened. "Il est mort," he said softly. "He is dead." They all stood frozen for a breathless moment. Then Poirot rose slowly, his voice cold and deliberate. The murderer has struck, and now, mes amis, the time for whispers is over. The truth must be laid bare, all of it. Chapter 9. The Vanishing of Rupert Lavington. The body of Sir Cedric Lavington remained undisturbed in his chair as Dr. Glenister was summoned once again. This time, not as a healer, but a certifier of death. Thunder grumbled in the distance, as if echoing the judgment passed within the walls of Lavington House. Poirot stood at the doorway of the study, arms folded tightly behind his back, his gaze not on the corpse, but on the frame of the door itself, as though considering what, or who, had passed through it last. "No sign of struggle," said Hastings, pacing the room slowly. "No broken glass, no disorder. The door was locked from the inside, you said?" "Oui," Poirot murmured. But the bolt was one of those old brass types, easily manipulated with a thin wire through the keyhole. A full sense of security, mon ami. Like many things in this house, Judith stood in the hall behind them, her face bloodless. "I swear, no one came out. I was just outside. There was nowhere else to go." Poirot turned to her. "Then the killer was gone before you arrived. Or they are still here somewhere, hiding in plain sight." A soft footfall broke the silence. Lydia appeared at the end of the corridor, her dressing gown drawn tightly around her, and her expression unreadable. "Is it true?" she asked. "Is he—" Poirot inclined his head solemnly. "Yes, mademoiselle. I regret to say that Sir Cedric is dead." She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply turned and walked slowly back down the corridor, her shadow stretching behind her like a ribbon pulled taut. That night, Poirot took command of the household. By morning, the rain had ceased, but a clammy mist lingered over the estate. The staff had been told to remain indoors. No one was to leave. Hastings, with the aid of the constable from the nearby village, helped secure the entrances. Judith took responsibility for Mrs. Redburn, who had briefly regained consciousness, but remained too weak to speak. At breakfast, the dining table felt colder and longer than it had before. Lydia sat at one end, Judith beside her. Ellery arrived late, carrying a tension so tightly wound it seemed to pull at the seams of his jacket. Poirot, who had not slept, sat silently, his eyes flicking from face to face. But Rupert Lavington was conspicuously absent. When Ellery inquired about him, Lydia looked up sharply. "He was in his room last night. I heard him come in just after the storm quieted." Poirot shook his head. "No, mademoiselle, he was not." Judith stiffened. "What do you mean?" "I entered his room this morning," Poirot said. "The bed was untouched, the wardrobe emptied of several garments, the perfume bottle we found, gone. So was the tin box beneath the floorboards." "But how?" Lydia asked. "Surely no one could have left unnoticed." "There is a servant's exit through the scullery," Poirot said, "normally bolted. Last night it was left unlatched. Rupert Lavington is no longer in this house." The table fell into stunned silence. Ellery recovered first. "If he fled, then surely that tells us everything we need to know. He killed Sir Cedric to keep the truth buried." "Perhaps," Poirot said coolly, "or perhaps he feared that someone else would ensure the truth did not emerge, and believed he would be next." Judith leaned forward. Are you saying Rupert might be innocent? I say only that his flight is not proof of guilt, it is proof of fear. But the question remains, what precisely was he afraid of? Hastings, who had returned from checking the outer grounds, stepped into the room at that moment with a damp coat in hand. He left footprints down the side path, he said, through the rose arch into the orchard, but they stop at the gate. There's no vehicle, no bicycle, just footprints, then nothing. Poirot's expression darkened. Then he did not flee far, or else he was intercepted. He stood. We will search the estate. Every outbuilding, every garden wall, the folly, the greenhouse, the tool sheds. He turned to Lydia. Mademoiselle, I ask for your assistance. You know this house better than any of us. She nodded, lips pressed thin. The next hour passed in a cold and restless flurry. Poirot, Hastings, and Lydia combed the eastern hedges. Judith and Ellery took the stable-yard and beyond. The mist clung to the grass like breath, and the silence of the grounds, broken only by distant crows, was unbearable. At last, Poirot signalled for them to regroup in the old greenhouse, a glass and brick structure long since overrun by vines and disuse. It was there, half buried under a rotted canvas tarp, that they found him. Rupert Lavington lay curled on his side between the flower troughs, unmoving. A thick blow to the temple had left a maroon stain along his hairline. His coat had been torn, and his right hand clenched something small and metallic. Poirot knelt, opened the stiff fingers, and withdrew a brooch, silver, delicate in the shape of a lily-of-the-valley blossom. Judith gasped. That belonged to... Poirot looked up sharply. To Lady Margaret, he finished. I have seen it in her portraits. He rose slowly, holding the brooch like a key. We have found our second victim, but also, perhaps, our first real clue. Rupert stirred then, barely, but enough. Poirot turned to Hastings. He must live. He must speak, for only he can tell us who struck the blow and why he ran. Chapter 10. The Gathering in the Morning Room. Rupert Lavington awoke the next morning under layers of wool blankets, a pale bandage wrapped around his head. He had been moved to the guest room beside the study, under strict instructions from Dr. Glenister not to speak at length, but Poirot, with his usual blend of charm and gravity, had persuaded the doctor to allow a short interview. Judith Gray and Lydia Lavington waited anxiously in the corridor as Poirot and Hastings entered the room. Rupert's face was waxy, drained of colour, but his eyes tracked them with a haunted clarity. He winced as he tried to sit up. "No, monsieur," Poirot said gently. "Lie back. You must conserve your strength. We will ask only what is necessary." Rupert's voice was hoarse. "I didn't kill him." Poirot inclined his head. "I believe you. But we must understand why you fled. What drove you from your bed, your home, and nearly to your death?" Rupert swallowed. "I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I went to study after the storm eased. I wanted to speak to Uncle Cedric. I wanted to tell him I knew about the child, about Matilda." "You confronted him?" "Yes. I told him about the letters, the photographs. He already knew, but he said she was dead, that she died in 1927. Poirot's brows lifted slightly. "And you believed him?" Rupert shook his head. "No, I asked if Lydia knew. If anyone knew, he became furious. Told me it was none of my concern. Said if I dared to stir up scandal, he'd cut me off for good. He reached into the drawer where he keeps the silver letter opener, and I thought for a second he might strike me with it. I left before he could. Poirot's voice was calm. And then? I packed a bag. I was going to go to the village inn, let things cool. But as I came down the scullery stairs, someone struck me from behind. Hard. I didn't see who. Just darkness. You awoke in the greenhouse. Rupert nodded weakly. I thought I was dying. But when I felt something cold in my hand, I realized I was meant to be found, and blamed. Poirot held up the silver brooch. This? Rupert nodded. I don't know how it got there, but it wasn't mine. I swear it. Poirot's expression did not change, but his eyes narrowed. Merci, monsieur. That is enough. Rest now. As they stepped into the corridor, Hastings spoke first. You believe him? I believe he was frightened, and someone used that fear, twisted it. Whoever struck him, wanted him silent, and wanted the brooch found. Poirot turned to Lydia and Judith, who stood nearby, listening. It is time, he said quietly. No more whispers. We must bring everyone together. I shall speak in the morning room. By late afternoon, the remaining members of the household gathered in the long, low morning room with its pale drapes and sun-faded upholstery. The storm had passed, but the air remained heavy. Poirot stood before the fireplace, hands folded neatly before him. To his left sat Lydia, composed but pale. Beside her, Judith Grey, eyes watchful. On the opposite side, Howard Ellery stood with, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Rupert, wrapped in a shawl and propped in a chair, offered only a nod when addressed. Poirot began with a slight bow. Mes amis, it is time to bring order to chaos. You have all been touched by the events of these past days. The whispers, the shattered portrait, the fall of Mrs. Redburn, the theft of Lady Margaret's letters, and now the murder of Sir Cedric. He paused. Yes, murder. Though there was no forced entry, no broken window. The crime was subtle, intended to appear passionate. But the true motive lay not in rage, but in preservation. The preservation of a secret. Ellery bristled. This is highly irregular. Poirot held up a hand. And yet necessary. He turned to the group. For decades, Lady Margaret Lavington concealed a child born out of wedlock. Matilda Beaufort, raised in France, kept secret from English society. The connection to Etienne Beaufort, a disgraced antiquities dealer, would have cast a long shadow over the Lavington name. Only a few knew the truth. He looked pointedly at Ellery. You were one of them, monsieur. Ellery hesitated. I suspected. I found references in her early files, but I was bound by discretion. Poirot nodded. Discretion, yes. But someone else, someone with more to lose, could not afford that truth to surface. When Lydia neared her full inheritance, a campaign began. Whispers, doubt, carefully orchestrated events to suggest instability. A whisper at her window, a stolen letter, a shattered portrait, the fall of a servant who remembered too much, and then murder. He turned slowly toward Judith. Judith stiffened. What are you implying? Poirot's tone did not change. You were more than a companion. You were once a schoolteacher in France. You speak fluent French. You knew Lady Margaret not only as a patron, but as your mother." A long silence fell across the room. Judith's voice came, slow and fragile. "How did you—" "From your scent, lily of the valley, Lady Margaret's perfume. You wore it. I smelled it at the stair where Mrs. Redburn fell. You wore it to remind yourself of her. And Rupert found her brooch in his hand, placed there, by someone who knew its sentimental value, someone who wanted to deflect suspicion." Judith's voice cracked. "I never meant to kill him." All eyes turned to her. "I only wanted the truth known. I wanted to claim what was mine." When Rupert said he would confront Sir Cedric, I knew what would follow. But Sir Cedric, he wasn't going to allow the truth. He told me as much. Said I was a stain, an embarrassment. He laughed, said he'd burn the records. I panicked. I didn't plan it. But when he turned his back, I was struck. Her hands trembled. I didn't mean to hurt Rupert. I only meant to frighten him. I thought if he vanished and the brooch was found, it would point to some family feud. But then he lived. Poirot stepped forward slowly. "Judith Grey, born Matilda Beaufort, daughter of Lady Margaret. You killed to claim your place, but not out of greed, out of longing, for a name, for recognition." Judith lowered her head, tears streaking her cheeks. Poirot turned to Lydia. "Your inheritance remains. Your name is unchanged. But now the shadows are gone." Lydia said nothing, but she rose, walked slowly to Judith, and placed a hand on her shoulder. The gesture said what words could not. Poirot looked to Hastings. "It is over." And the silence that followed felt, at last, like peace. Chapter 11. The ink beneath the signature 2 days had passed since Judith Grey, Matilda Beaufort, confessed to the murder of Sir Cedric Lavington. The news, while yet to reach the wider world, had settled over Lavington House like a veil of ash. Soft, mournful, but final, the constable from Winchford had taken her into custody quietly, and Lydia, pale but composed, had provided a statement affirming her mother's connection to Judith and Judith's own presence in the house as her companion governess. Poirot had remained at the manor, citing a lingering curiosity. Hastings, more accustomed to leaving once the murderer was in handcuffs, had found this delay somewhat irregular. "You've already solved it, Poirot," he said the next morning as they sat in the breakfast room. "Surely there's nothing more to dig up?" "No, Hastings," Poirot replied, stirring his coffee delicately. "The crime is solved, but the truth, the truth, mon ami, that is often less cooperative. I sense something out of place, a detail that resists a tidy conclusion." Before Hastings could respond, Howard Ellery entered, holding a sealed envelope. His manner was more subdued than usual, though his shirt remained crisply ironed, his tie tight. "This was found in Sir Cedric's personal safe," he said, handing it to Poirot. "It appears he added a codicil to his will just before his death. I thought you might like to see it before I read it aloud to the family." Poirot took the envelope, nodded politely, and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, handwritten in Sir Cedric's slanted script, "To whom it may concern. Should anything befall me, let it be known that I have come to accept the truth of Margaret's firstborn. I have instructed Ellery to amend the trust to ensure that Matilda Beaufort known to this household as Judith Grey, receives an annuity and recognition as Margaret's lawful heir. Cedric Lavington. Hastings blinked. He was going to acknowledge her after all? Poirot's gaze did not lift from the letter. So it seems. Ellery shifted uneasily. It was unsigned, unfortunately. Still in his safe. Legally it carries no weight. No, Poirot murmured, but morally it weighs everything. Lydia entered a moment later, still dressed in muted grey. Her presence felt older now, heavier, as though the inheritance had added years. She accepted the letter silently, read it once, and then folded it carefully. "I'd like it kept," she said, "not for the court, for the memory." Poirot inclined his head. "A wise request, mademoiselle." Later that afternoon, Hastings found Poirot in the study, gazing at the shattered portrait of Lady Margaret, which had been reframed but left leaning against the wall. Still pondering the unsolved detail, Hastings asked. Poirot nodded. "There is a question that nags, not about guilt, but intent. Judith or Matilda said she did not plan the killing. And yet she had access. The perfume, the brooch, the knowledge of Beaufort's letters. She struck twice, Hastings, once with whispers, once with steel. That takes calculation. But one thing troubles me most." "What?" Poirot gestured to the brooch they had found in Rupert's hand. It was not merely a red herring. It was symbolic, a relic of Margaret. Judith claimed she planted it, but I believe she did not. Hastings frowned. Then who did? Poirot reached into his pocket and produced a second letter, small, folded, and bearing the Lavington seal. He opened it and handed it to Hastings. "To Hercule Poirot. If I am dead before we speak, know that I have not always been a kind man, but I have tried to be just one. Judith, Matilda, is Margaret's child. I have known for months. I placed the brooch myself in Rupert's hand when I found him unconscious. I wanted it to be discovered. Let the world know who she is. C.L." Hastings looked up, stunned. "Then Sir Cedric?" Poirot nodded slowly. He knew he was dying, not just by Judith's hand, but long before. Dr. Glenister mentioned a heart condition. Cedric expected death. He wanted to die knowing the truth would surface. Hastings exhaled. So, in the end, he protected her. With a final act of justice, dressed as misdirection. Poirot closed the letter and returned it to his coat. "As I said, Hastings, the crime is solved, but the heart of a man, that takes longer to read." That evening Poirot prepared to leave Lavington House. As the car pulled up, Lydia stood by the garden path, watching the low clouds drift past the hedges. "You've done more than solve a crime," she said softly. "You've untied a knot that bound this house for decades." Poirot gave a gentle smile. "No, mademoiselle, I simply followed the thread. It is you who must now choose how to weave what remains." She nodded, eyes glistening. As Poirot stepped into the car beside Hastings, he cast one last glance at the house. The tall windows, the ivy-clad brick, the shadows behind the glass. "Do you believe justice was done?" Hastings asked as they pulled away. Poirot folded his hands. Justice, Hastings, is rarely perfect, but in this case it whispered the truth, softly, at a window, and finally someone listened. Chapter 12. The Last Whisper. The motor car wound its way through the rolling countryside, leaving the shadow of Lavington House behind as the hedgerows turned golden in the mellow afternoon light. The rain had cleansed the air, and the sharp scent of damp earth lingered as Hastings drove in silence, content to let the rhythm of the wheels soothe his thoughts. Beside him, Hercule Poirot sat with his gloved hands folded neatly in his lap, his gaze fixed not on the road ahead, but somewhere beyond it, beyond fields and fences, and into the delicate structure of human motive that had once again revealed itself to him piece by piece. "Do you remember," Poirot said at last, "when you asked me why I did not leave the moment Judith confessed?" Hastings glanced sideways. "I do. You said the case was not entirely finished." "Ah, mais oui." And it was not. He withdrew from his pocket the final letter, Sir Cedric's private confession, the one written to Poirot alone, never intended for courts or solicitors. "It was not the crime that bothered me," Poirot continued. "It was the quietness of the murder. A man like Cedric Lavington, proud and controlling, would not have let himself fall without resistance, and yet he did, because he chose to." Hastings furrowed his brow. "You believe he allowed Judith to kill him?" Poirot nodded slightly. "She came to confront him, yes. In her passion, she may have raised the weapon. But he did not stop her. He had already placed the brooch, already written his letters, already arranged for the codicil. He held up the letter. He welcomed death as penance." Hastings looked out the window, the weight of that thought settling in. "Then it wasn't murder in the conventional sense?" "No," Poirot said softly. "It was the end. A culmination of guilt, of shame, of late-born love for a daughter, denied. Sir Cedric's last act was not one of cruelty, but of release. For Judith, for Lydia, for himself." They drove on in thoughtful silence. The sky was beginning to open, blue breaking between the clouds. "And Judith?" Hastings asked. "She will face the law," Poirot replied, "but not with fury. She acted in pain, not malice. I have written to the magistrate myself, with the facts, and with the truth behind them." He leaned back, adjusting his collar. "Sometimes, mon ami, justice is not about punishment. It is about acknowledgement. That is what Judith wanted, not money, not revenge, simply to be seen." Hastings nodded slowly. "And Lydia?" "Lydia will carry the house, the name, the future. But she will carry it with open eyes now. No longer in the shadow of a painted mother, but with knowledge of the whole woman, and of the sister who lived alongside her, unknowing. The sun broke through fully now, casting a warm light across the road. The fields stretched wide and endless ahead. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. "So many crimes," he said, "begin in silence, in things left unsaid, in faces not recognized, in names never spoken. But this one ended with a whisper heard and believed." The car continued down the road, the manor behind them fading into memory. And as the clouds parted, Hercule Poirot, the great detective, let his eyes rest, not on the clues or the guilt or the mystery, but on the golden horizon before him.